So I've been on a bit of a Max Payne kick recently. I just played through the entire trilogy and even played through the weird isometric GBA port for the first time. With that said, when it comes to Max Payne, the discussion inevitably always leads back to Max Payne 3 and whether or not it was a worthy follow-up to the other games. Personally, I do think it's a pretty undeniable step back in a great many ways. It has its own strengths, but I find that it ends up downplaying a lot of what made the first two Max Payne games as fun as they were. I will defend it in certain ways, such as how I think it's entirely plausible that Max would still be traumatized over the death of his family even many years later, despite the fact that he seemed okay at the end of the second game.
I had a dream of my wife. She was dead, but it was all right.
To me, that's one of those things where the trauma doesn't simply disappear even if a storyteller wants to tell you that it has. With that said, I do have many issues with the game, just as many other people do. I don't appreciate the fact that they took a game with an iconic run-and-gun action formula and turned it into what amounts to a cover shooter that happens to have a slow motion mechanic. I don't like that they abandoned the graphic novel style of presentation of the previous games. I'm not a fan of the aggressively linear level design to the point where a lot of the environments just don't feel real. Unlike previous games that gave you a nice middle ground between having linear design and giving you some minor exploratory elements. But for me, there's one issue that stands above them all. Matter of fact, I've kind of had a bone to pick with this game's storytelling for a number of years. This is a topic I've wanted to cover for a while, but have resisted for a while, especially since YouTube has this weird thing about discussing things like substance abuse. But since I'm doing what amounts to an impromptu Max Payne marathon, I figured there's no time like the present. So let's cover the basics first. In this game, it's been 9 years since the events of Max Payne 2. At some point, Max is at a bar, sulking and drinking away his pension when somebody who claims to be an old friend of his rolls up and tries to recruit him for a private security gig, something he's initially hesitant to do, but eventually agrees to do once he earns the ire of a local mob boss and needs to get out of town in a hurry. Personally, I think that given the amount of mob bosses that Max Payne has soloed, this should be no problem for him. Dude took down Vladimir Lem while he had the backing of the Inner Circle. Yeah, sure, that was 9 years ago, but that's a much bigger deal. But never mind. That's not the point I'm wanting to get at. Once he chooses to join the private security operations, things operate at a varying level of smoothness for a few months. But in spite of the fact that he's halfway across the world and has a new job he has to do, that still doesn't mean that he's out of the woods as far as his trauma is concerned.
I tried not to think about when it was that my existence became less about the things that make up people's lives and more about the holes that losing those things leave behind.
As a matter of fact, he was an addict before he left, and he ends up being even more of an addict now, spending his nights drinking and taking pills to try and numb the pain of all his years of trauma to the point of stumbling to bed once he's reached his limit for each night. I think this is a really good place to start, showing the hero at an obvious low point before showing him rising from the ashes, showing a previously troubled person overcoming their demons for the betterment of himself and everyone around him. And having a self-destructive addiction is one of the lowest points you could possibly show a character overcoming. And one of the aspects of the story I really enjoy is the fact that he's constantly failing himself as much as he's failing the people around him. While he's constantly drinking himself to sleep, he's also allowing paramilitary gangs and regular gangs to kidnap and kill the people he's supposed to be looking after. While he doesn't yet realize he's being actively sabotaged by the people above him on the totem pole, it's still a clear parallel. He is a massive screw-up who's failing everyone around him, including himself. By the time he decides to make a change, he lets half the family that he's supposed to be looking after die or get kidnapped. Hence, there's supposed to be this triumphant moment in the middle of the game where he makes a pledge to make a change. After several failures in a row, he decides to go sober for the sake of himself and the people he's protecting, because clarity is more important than drowning his sorrows.
I decided that I was gonna die sober, not drunk.
They even visually mark the point of the change being made by having Max shave his head as a visual signifier of the old Max Payne being dead and the new Max Payne being an avenging angel that has risen from the ashes of his old life. Awesome. There's just several problems with that though. So the first point of contention comes with his success rate. He eventually ends up with a much higher batting average than he did before he decided to make the change. The key word there is eventually. But the triumphant part of making a change needs to be immediately followed by the character who made the change succeeding where they previously failed. That's storytelling 101, make a change, then succeed. That doesn't happen here because by the next level, he's still failing at his goals. The very first thing he does after this is that he goes into the slums of Sao Paulo and he follows a kid whom he trusts for some reason, which then leads him into a mugging. This is the first thing that happens. Dude makes a change and immediately gets mugged and gets kicked into a ditch. From there, you go through the level, which is pretty indistinguishable from the rest of the levels in the game, except for the fact that you're fighting through a rundown neighborhood, in this case to get to a gang hideout. As ever, there's a disconnect between story and gameplay here in that within the story he's consistently failing, while in the gameplay he's an unstoppable badass who can miraculously heal his wounds just by shooting someone else in the head while holding painkillers. This frustrating dichotomy comes to a head at the end of the level when he attempts to break into the gang hideout, guns blazing, only to find himself surrounded by several other gang members who have significantly more powerful weapons than he does. In gameplay, you could easily take all these people out, but we're dealing with cutscene Max here. But that's the very least of it. Aside from the fact that this is a stupid hot-headed decision to make even by the standards of Max Payne, this once again shows the very inconsistent nature of the storytelling. He's a new man reborn, and then completely screws the pooch like he did before. So in this particular moment, what was even the point of having him change if, from a storytelling perspective, they weren't willing to make him feel in any way triumphant? He's the exact same f***up he was before. Sure, you could make the case that simply deciding to make a change doesn't automatically make you less of a screw-up. In real life, sure, but this is fiction. And in a fictional work like this, what's even the point of doing this if you're not going to signify the change by having things actually start to go the character's way? Reality and compelling storytelling aren't always mutually exclusive. And you can also make the case that he's only paying lip service to the idea of making a change and really he's just the same old Max Payne. But that doesn't feel like what they were going for here. It comes across as if they were genuinely trying to make it feel like a new era, only to not make it feel like a new era in the slightest once they had to put their money where their mouths were. He watches them execute one of the hostages he was trying to rescue in front of him, and later you watch another one of the hostages get burnt alive. It's only once he's able to rescue the third hostage that it finally feels like there's a slight bit of triumph to the story. After which he generally becomes a lot more competent and successful at what he sets out to do. I guess for what it's worth, there's no other place in the story to naturally fit him pledging to make a change and shaving his head because from this moment forward, the game is pretty much non-stop action until the end of the game. But it still makes the story and its intentions feel relatively inconsistent, as if they can't decide themselves whether or not Max is a massive f***up or whether he's supposed to be succeeding once there's a hard cutoff of the before and after. And if that was what they were intending to go for, there's no reason they couldn't have just restructured the story a bit. But you know what? Not having a natural place to fit something and still having him start to succeed on a bit of a delay, that's fine, I suppose. Sometimes we're limited by the story we're looking to tell and have to push past a few writing quirks in order to get to the destination we want to get to. And if this was the only writing quirk, I would say the story as presented was acceptable, if not well presented. But then there's the other half of this decision they made. The decision to make him succeed or not is only a decision in writing. It's not necessarily an attribute of the world these characters occupy. It doesn't necessarily ruin the story because at least it's something that can be justified by using real-world logic instead of the logic of storytelling. But as far as the overall story is concerned, him going sober is sort of the linchpin that creates the turning point in the game. This is like the prime #1 attribute this part of the story has. He quits his vices, and from then on he's a clear-minded man looking to fix the things he broke. And we as an audience are cheering him on because we can see how harmful his vices have been to him, and we want to see him overcome that. Awesome. But why then does he not actually go sober? Why are painkillers still a healing item? This is the part that has always irked me. Here's the thing, I get that painkillers have been the iconic healing item the series has used since day one, probably just for the pun, but it's outright stated in this game that part of his addiction is to painkillers.
I knew I wasn't thinking straight. I'd been drinking and popping painkillers for years. I had a liver like a French goose and skin like red leather.
And from that, it's all but stated that we as the player are sort of responsible on account of using it as a healing item for the past 2 games. I guess the idea is you can't take that many painkillers to get through hostile situations without growing a dependence on them. That's totally fine, it ties the story and the gameplay together in that sense. That is when he wants or needs to actually take them. But then they completely remove that gameplay story connection when the story becomes about Max overcoming his addictions, and in this case, we still have to use his addiction as a means to survive the game. It's not something they expect you to overlook. This is something they point out through Max's dialogue when he picks up painkillers post-sobriety.
I was running the risk of becoming too clear-headed. One vice at a time. This was going to be a safe medical detox.
Almost as if they're poking fun at the idea of him getting sober at all. To me, this is absolutely catastrophic to the story the game is going for, because it takes the very powerful, very heartfelt idea of someone overcoming a destructive personality flaw and completely discarding it the moment we get back into gameplay. Like, yeah, you had your fun with your emotionally gripping drama, now let's get back to the real game. That right there is the biggest flaw with Max Payne 3. Suspension of disbelief goes completely out of the window as the gameplay conflicts with the story in a way that's so front and center. They can't even get away with hand-waving it away. It's something they're forced to acknowledge. And they acknowledge it in the worst way possible. I get that the more destructive aspects of his addiction was the alcohol, and he wasn't necessarily pledging to go sober as far as the painkillers are concerned. He could have just been pledging to quit alcohol. So it's not necessarily a contradiction, but if that's the case, it's a half-assed plot point. Because then they're going out of their way to say that he's only going halfway with his vices because, once again, we know he's addicted to painkillers as well. It says right there on the back of the box. Matter of fact, they don't even mention alcohol on the back of the box, so you can interpret the painkillers as being the primary vice. And this is all for the sake of not having to come up with a new healing item in the game. Rockstar Games have always had a knack for storytelling, pushing the limits of what good storytelling in games can be. And so when you have a company like this that has a game with a flaw this obvious, you have to wonder what they were thinking. The biggest question at this point is, what could they have done to prevent this ludonarrative dissonance? Well, the obvious choice is they could have chosen a new healing item to center the game around. It's not unheard of for games like this to switch up specific things like this partway through the game. I don't have a specific item in mind that could have replaced the painkillers. Maybe that's something the comments can think up. What is something someone getting off painkillers could use as an alternative for the sake of restoring health and getting through these tough scenarios that's relatively logical to the story, and is something that's widely available in Sao Paulo, Brazil? Keep in mind, I don't think it really needs to make much sense, because healing in games is never going to make sense, it just needs to not be catastrophically stupid. Maybe after this point we can switch to a more standard system of health restoring by itself. If you're at critical health, a bit of your health does come back whenever you don't get shot for a while, so perhaps the excuse could be that Max is so beyond determined to finish the job he started that his health is coming back through sheer force of will. Or maybe he's not necessarily getting better, he's just choosing to push through the pain. The idea isn't even unfounded. You could make the argument that him getting healthier allows his already partial health restoration to be much more effective once he's off the stuff. I think that actually makes some sense for a plot hinging on this sort of thing. The other option is that they could acknowledge the fact that Max is still struggling with his addiction. Perhaps he knows that he has to get clean and wants to get clean, but is still sinking into certain vices for the sake of trying to get through this current conflict. You could establish something like Max knowing that he's going to get off the painkillers once this is over because, unlike the booze, he needs the painkillers to get through these tough situations on account of how many bullets he's taken. If he can't numb himself to the pain, he'll find himself unable to finish the job he started. Really, any number of things could have been better than what they ended up doing here, which was basically choosing not to worry about it. Which is annoying because there are a lot of parts to this game that I feel are actually really good. It's just this one aspect, taking inarguably the most important part of the plot and completely ruining it by not treating it with any level of respect that's so ruinous and so objectively poorly thought out that it takes a significant chunk out of the story's quality. If I were to boil it down to a sentence, the fatal flaw of Max Payne 3 is the inability to commit to the story it's telling, because this is a very story-heavy game and a very story-heavy series. When you have something like 4 hours worth of cutscenes, the story better be good. And when I sit here, I see such a basic yet critical error in the story they're attempting to tell to the point where it completely undermines itself. I can't help but feel frustrated at what could have been. I mean, really, the inability to decide what they want this game to be seeps its way into most aspects of the game. They can't decide if they want it to be a cover shooter or a high-octane run-and-gun. They can't decide if they want the story to be grounded or slightly goofy. And in this case, they can't decide if they want to tell a story of triumph or continue on the same path they were on for the sake of gameplay. What a shame. Results may vary, but this is a problem I've never been able to get over in Max Payne 3, and it single-handedly makes this game worse than the other two games for me, even if there weren't other things I didn't like about this game to begin with. So let me know in the comment section what you think, and otherwise than that, if you like this video, you can leave a like, comment telling me what you think, subscribe, and hit the notification icon so you're always up to date on what I'm doing. Also, hit the hype button if you're on mobile, for whatever that does. I've been the King of Snark Style right here on Tactical Bacon Productions, and I will see you next time. Stay crispy, my friends.